A single unfinished sentence, spoken by a 91-year-old woman who has spent 70 years commanding a stage, did more to explain a decades-old mystery than 1,000 magazine profiles ever could. In October 2024, sitting on a small stage in England, Dame Judi Dench opened her mouth to talk about grief and simply couldn't finish. The audience watched one of the most composed actresses in the world lose her words completely. And in that unscripted silence, the truth about her relationship with Dame Maggie Smith finally came out, not as a headline, not as a rehearsed tribute, but as something far more real. For most of their public lives, Judi Dench and Maggie Smith were treated as a kind of British institution locked in permanent, playful combat. Two dames, two national treasures, constantly compared to one another. Who was funnier, who was asked first, who had aged into the role of national icon more gracefully. The tabloids loved the framing because it was easy, rivals in public, maybe something colder in private. Anyone who watched their interviews together saw the teasing, the interrupting, the dry one-liners fired back and forth like well-rehearsed volleys. It looked, to a casual observer, like two women who tolerated each other because their careers kept crossing paths. What it actually was turned out to be something almost the opposite, and it took a public collapse into tears, decades into their friendship, for the wider world to finally understand it. To understand why that moment mattered so much, you have to go back to where it all started, in a cramped dressing room in London in the 1950s. Judi Dench and Maggie Smith were born just weeks apart in December 1934, Dench in Yorkshire, Smith in Essex, and by the time they were in their early 20s, both had found their way to the Old Vic Theatre, one of the toughest proving grounds in British acting, where Dame Maggie had been friends with Dame Judi since meeting in the 1950s at the Old Vic Theatre in London. This wasn't a friendship that began with warmth and small talk. It began with two ambitious young actresses sizing each other up in an industry that offered women very few chances to break through, and even fewer chances to stay relevant once they did. They were rehearsing constantly, sharing cramped backstage space, and quietly clocking each other's work in a world where every role mattered because there simply weren't that many to go around. That environment shaped the shorthand they'd use with each other for the rest of their lives. Neither woman was the sentimental type, not in public, and reportedly not in private either. Their affection showed up as banter, not declarations. In interviews together over the years, you'd hear them trade jabs that sounded almost combative to an outsider but were clearly, to anyone paying attention, the language of two people who trusted each other completely. At one point, reflecting on the fact that both women kept working well into their 80s, Dench remarked that they'd both go on working forever if they were asked, and Smith, deadpan as ever, shot back that Dench was always asked first. It's a tiny exchange, but it says everything about how they operated, needling each other about the very insecurities that came with aging in a brutal industry, using humor to say what neither of them wanted to say directly. Over the following decades, their careers didn't just run in parallel. They kept colliding, on stage and on screen, in ways that built a shared history very few other actors could claim. They appeared together in the 1985 film A Room with a View, a role that's still considered one of the definitive British literary adaptations of its era. They reunited for Franco Zeffirelli's Tea with Mussolini in 1999, and again for the 2004 costume drama Ladies in Lavender, in which they played two Cornish sisters caring for a shipwrecked stranger. In the 2010s, they became unlikely favorites of a whole new generation of moviegoers as part of the ensemble cast of the Best Exotic Marigold Hotel and its sequel. On stage, they shared the West End in David Hare's Play the Breath of Life in the early 2000s, a two-hander that put their chemistry front and center for audiences night after night. Dench starred with Smith in 1985's A Room with a View, remaining close friends through their next collaborations in 1999, 2004, 2011, and its 2015 sequel. And they also appeared on stage together in a West End play from 2002 to 2003. Their overlapping resumes weren't a coincidence. Casting directors knew exactly what they were getting when they put these two in the same production, and audiences kept responding to it. That overlap is also what fed the rivalry narrative for so long. If two actresses of the same generation, the same nationality, and the same towering reputation keep getting compared for 70 years, it's almost inevitable that people start looking for cracks. Was one secretly resentful of the other's Oscar wins? Did one privately think the other got the better parts? The truth is far less dramatic and far more human. They understood exactly what the other had given up to get where she was, because they'd lived through the same industry, the same scarcity, the same pressure to keep proving themselves as the years went on. Competition was real between them. It would be strange if it weren't, but it never curdled into resentment, because they had something most professional rivals never get, a shared witness to the whole climb. Their private lives ran on similarly overlapping tracks of loss and resilience, even though the details differed. Maggie Smith married actor Robert Stevens in 1967, a marriage that ended in divorce in the mid-1970s, and later married playwright Beverly Cross, who remained her husband until his death in 1998. Smith's spouses were Robert Stevens, whom she married in 1967 and divorced in 1975, and Beverly Cross, whom she married in 1975 until his death in 1998. She never remarried after that, and by most accounts kept that part of her life almost entirely out of the public eye. Judi Dench, for her part, was married to actor Michael Williams from 1971 until his death from cancer in 2001, a loss that she has spoken about publicly on multiple occasions over the years as something that fundamentally changed how she approached her work and her grief. Two women, on paper, living very different domestic lives, but both understood, in a very specific and personal way, what it meant to keep working, keep showing up, keep performing, while carrying a private loss that the public rarely got to see. Wikipedia. That shared understanding of loss is really what set the stage for what happened in October 2024. Maggie Smith died on September 27th of that year, at the age of 89, just over a week apart from the death of another close friend and collaborator, actress Barbara Lee Hunt. Barely a week after losing both women, Judi Dench appeared on stage at the Cheltenham Literature Festival for what was meant to be a fairly ordinary conversation about her career. Instead, the interviewer, actor and director Brendan O'Hara, gently brought up the losses she'd just suffered, and asked her to explain something she'd said before, that she once compared the feeling of grief to petrol. He asked Dench what she had meant when she compared grief to petrol, and she began to answer, "I suppose because the energy that's created by grief," before cutting herself off, apparently lost for words. She never finished the sentence. In front of a room full of people, one of the most disciplined and celebrated performers of her generation simply ran out of words and had to sit with the tears instead. Well, it's worth pausing on how unusual that moment was for someone with Dench's reputation. This is a woman who trained at one of Britain's most demanding drama schools, who spent 70 years mastering control on stage, who has played queens, spies, and headmistresses with an icy command of every syllable. For her to lose that composure completely, in public, over a single unanswered question about grief, tells you something that no carefully worded public statement ever could. She wasn't performing sadness for an audience. She was caught by it, mid-sentence, the same way anyone is caught by grief when it arrives at the wrong moment. And what she was grieving wasn't a colleague or a professional acquaintance. It was someone who had known her since she was 22 years old, someone who had shared dressing rooms, stages, film sets, and decades of private jokes that the public was never fully let in on. What makes this even more moving is what came out months later, when Dench spoke about a much quieter, much more private tribute she'd paid to her friend. Dench has a habit of planting individual trees at her home in Surrey in memory of people she's lost. She's done it for other friends and collaborators over the years, and for her late husband as well. When Smith died, Dench planted a tree for her too. In an interview recorded for a BBC tribute broadcast in late December 2024, Dench revealed that her gardener had recently found that the small sapling planted for Smith had produced its first piece of fruit, a single crabapple. She said she carried that apple in her pocket to Smith's funeral. Dench shared that her gardener had discovered the sapling she planted for Smith had borne fruit, telling the broadcaster she'd had one little crabapple in her pocket at Smith's funeral, which was a very nice thing to have. It's a small, almost private detail, the kind of thing you'd only really do for someone whose loss you were still working through on your own terms, far away from cameras and festival stages. That's not the gesture of a rival. That's the gesture of someone who lost a piece of her own history. West End Theatre. Looking back at their decades of teasing interviews with that context in mind changes how you read every one of them. The sharp remarks about who got asked first, the interruptions, the mock complaints about each other's careers, none of that reads as coldness anymore. It reads as two women who had earned the right to tease each other because they'd survived the same industry together, side by side, since they were in their 20s. Their friendship was documented, in a quieter way, in the 2018 film Nothing Like a Dame, where Dench, Smith, and fellow actresses Eileen Atkins and Joan Plowright sat together reminiscing about their careers, and the footage captured exactly the kind of dynamic long-time observers had always suspected was there: warm, funny, a little combative, completely unguarded with each other in a way none of them were with outsiders. There's also something worth noting about how both women handle the passage of time in an industry that has historically not been kind to older actresses. Rather than fading from view as they aged, Both leaned into roles that used their age as a strength rather than treating it as a limitation. Smith's late career work as the Dowager Countess in Downton Abbey and as Professor McGonagall in the Harry Potter films introduced her to entirely new generations of audiences well into her 70s and 80s. Dench, meanwhile, took on the role of M in the James Bond franchise and kept working steadily in film, television, and audio well past the age when most performers, especially women, are pushed out of major roles. Neither of them treated their later years as a slow exit. They treated them as new chapters, and in doing so, they quietly expanded what audiences expected from older actresses altogether. What Judi Dench's tears at Cheltenham revealed wasn't a secret feud finally admitted, and it wasn't some hidden resentment surfacing after decades of suppression. It was the opposite of every rumor that had followed them for 70 years. It was proof that two women who had spent their entire adult lives being publicly measured against each other had actually spent that same time quietly building one of the most enduring friendships in British theatre and film. The competition was real. The teasing was real. But underneath both of those things was a woman who, when asked to explain her grief, couldn't get the sentence out, because the person she'd lost had been there for almost everything that ever happened to her. Rivalry and love aren't opposites. Sometimes, as Judi Dench showed the world in a moment she never planned to have on camera, they're built out of exactly the same material. Two people who spent a lifetime pushing each other to be better and never stopped showing up for one another once the cameras went away.